So this looks at a couple of more advanced ways that you can treat your compositions in After Effects. Now this looks at nesting sequences or nesting compositions rather, and also something called pre-composition, which I'll come to in a moment. Now what I'm going to do here to illustrate this is to create some new compositions. Now remember that when you're creating a composition you have to be mindful of the actual format that you're working with. Now I'm going to create a HDV 1080 project or composition here, so that this will be the format that I use when I output it. I'm going to call this background shapes. Now the idea here is that I'm going to treat my lozenge or diamond shape and my red shape as background objects, and then I'm going to look at my stars as foreground objects. So what I can do is I can take my two layers here, now my lozenge and my red shape, I can drag them down into the composition that I've just made called background shapes. Now I'm actually going to push the red shape up over the yellow shape. Well, that's fine, I'll leave that as it is. Now what I'm going to do is create another composition. Sorry, I'm not importing media, I'm creating a composition. So I click this button and I'm going to call this foreground shapes. It's also HDV 1080 25, so that's fine. Now that's automatically opened here. I can see foreground shapes in the tab, so I can get my two stars now, and I can click and drag those over onto the screen here. So I select that star there and move it over there a little bit. And we won't worry about why these shapes are slightly warped. That's actually something that I'll look at in a later video, but just for the moment we'll leave them as is. So I have foreground shapes, I have background shapes. Now nesting sequences means that I can, or nesting compositions rather, I finally cut pro on the brain. Nesting compositions means putting one composition inside in another. So what I have is my foreground shapes and my background shapes. So what I can do now is I can create a new composition, and I call it parent comp, just to show that the child comps are going into an overall or parent composition. Click OK. Now my parent comp is empty. I have my background and my foreground shapes compositions, so I can now click and drag background shapes in here, and I can get foreground shapes, and I can also drag them in there. Okay, so what I have now is I have my shapes broken up and kind of grouped together in compositions. So if I was to do something to my foreground shapes, I could do it to both at the same time. So the reason that you nest sequences is if you want to apply a certain effect or animation to a group of objects and you want it to happen to them all at the same time. So another thing that I could do is change the opacity on my two stars simultaneously. I might get my background shapes and I might scale them down and then have them zoom forward and have my stars fade up as I do. Now I can do that to both background shapes together because they are nested within the parent composition together in a single composition in themselves. Okay, so that is nesting compositions. And the other way that you can approach compositions is doing something called pre-composing. Now I'm going to just leave these alone for the moment and go up to my original composition that came in when I imported my vector shape. So you'll remember that you can import an Illustrator file as a composition with layers. So I'll open that up. Now here I have my complete set of layers in one composition. Now let's say that I wanted to do the exact same thing that I just did a moment ago, but I don't want to be dragging compositions into other compositions. Well, I can kind of do it from the reverse in a sense by selecting the objects that I want to group together in a composition, and that would be lozenge and red shape, for example, and then I go up to layer and down to pre-compose, or I can go Apple, Shift and C. Now if you look at the layers, you'll see that, well, first of all you have to fill in this, so I want to give this again, I'll call this, I'll give it a different name this time so there's no confusion. I'll call it red and yellow. Now, I want to move all of these attributes, being these two layers here, into the new composition, and I want to open the new composition. I'll deselect that for the moment because I don't want to open the new composition. Click OK. Now if you look at the layers, you'll see that those two layers have been replaced by a composition, and those two layers have been moved inside in that composition. So now I'm looking inside in my red and yellow composition that I've just created, which is in fact now being treated as a layer in itself inside in my parent composition, which is showtime backdrop vector. I can do the same with star 1 and star 2. So this is my parent composition now, and these two layers are now going to be kind of wrapped in their own composition and left here on the timeline. So Shift Apple C, I'll call this stars, and click OK, and there you have it. The two layers have now been moved inside in this stars composition, and the stars composition, like all of the other compositions that I've been creating up until now, are available in the project panel. So I can go into stars by clicking there, and that allows me to see the inside of the composition that I've just made. Now, you also have this little tool here which is very handy. If you're inside in a composition and you want to know where that composition is currently placed, you can kind of trace it back with this little flow chart. So this tells me that stars is currently stored inside in showtime backdrop vector. Now, I could also open up this parent comp here, and I could bring stars in there just by clicking and dragging it down. So I can reuse this composition as many times as I need. Now when I go into stars and I click on my flowchart, you'll see that it tells me that it's inside in two compositions. It's inside in parent comp, and it's inside in showtime backdrop vector. So pre-composing is something that you're going to get used to using on a regular basis as a means of grouping objects together inside in compositions and then leaving those compositions inside in other compositions as layers. So just to go in again there to show time backdrop vector, I've pre-comped my star layers into a composition. I've pre-comped my red and yellow shape into a composition, so I can then do things like property changes and scale changes to them as well.